Hey, hey, Bitcoin wealth builders. So Simon Dixon here again. I want to answer the question that a lot of people have been asking, because there's a lot of people that are kind of in cope mode right now. And I'd like to do a few if-then scenarios to just help people understand. So look, I don't listen to political rhetoric. I don't listen to the media. The media was bought by the intelligence agencies a long time ago, and politicians were bought by intelligence agencies a long time ago. The layer 3 model that I've always talked about, which is that the central bank is the top of the power structure because they have a debt-based Ponzi scheme that requires systematic more debt to be created in order to keep the dollar alive. They have a criminal organization. Part of it is working on national security, but the vast majority of it is working for corporate interests, and that is the intelligence, CIA, Mossad, MI6. These are global institutions. They don't have America first ideologies. They're not connected to any country. And they do whatever they need to do. They were set up in order to harvest and have illegal operations. So if you look at the formation of the CIA from Operation Paperclip, it was a partnership between Nazis, the Italian mafia, and parts of the influential Jewish mob. And they partnered with corporate interests in order to support drug trafficking, human trafficking, sex trafficking, and weapons trafficking in order to do covert regime changes. And since World War II, America's engaged in over 100 known declassified operations in order to do things like replace democracies with dictators and use the International Monetary Fund in order to get the world addicted to dollars so that they could use their soft power in order to rape, pillage, and steal from the resources that they needed for corporate interests, and that include weapons trafficking operations and various other things. Read the book Operation Gladio to understand, and the banking money laundering networks by Paul Williams to understand how the operation was set up. Right, anyway. With that background, most people listen to politicians and think that they have democracies. Democracy is an illusion to distract the people to think that they have a degree of autonomy, when the reality is that the money printers, the flowing of funds through these laundering operations, and intelligence get to operate both bribery networks or rings. For example, Mossad used the Epstein network in order to gain political control for the U.S. outpost Israel, which is part of U.S. foreign policy, which made essentially the dollar $7.5 trillion based upon all of the wars that it created and all of the covert regime changes that it uses in order for the economic hitmen to perpetuate the dollar and get the world addicted to dollars so that they can control their economies. And then, at the extreme, there are assassination attempts and the threat of assassination and various other soft powers. By that, it means that any politician, any president, any Congress member, any Senate member, any parliamentary member has to get through this network in order to allow to be a politician in the first place, whether it be accepting lobby money or whether, as you become more influential, more extreme measures like blackmail and the threat of political, be in connection with pedophilia or sex scandals or various other things in the blackmail network that exist in these black op operations. So then, with that background, you ask, is it possible that Trump is systemically weakening the dollar in order to remove the world reserve currency status of the dollar? And to answer that question, I just say, well, what is layer 1, the central bank, and layer 2, the intelligence criminal network, and its shareholders of the central bank, like the banks, the global institutions, and all of their network of control through the fund management industry, the commercial banking industry that creates the dollars in the first place, and the technocracies that we are transitioning to through the companies and entrepreneurs that were given all of the technology of the government, like Elon, in order to play successful entrepreneur to create backdoors for the military-industrial complex. What do they want to happen? What is happening at the highest level? Well, because America securitized itself, financialized itself, made all of the politicians open to the highest bidder, and essentially prostituted its whole political process and all of its companies and organizations, there was a systemic weakening of the dollar based upon Griffin's dilemma. Not weakening of the dollar, sorry. It was a strengthening of the dollar based upon Griffin's dilemma. So if you all look up in Grok or Google or Wikipedia or ChatGPT, Griffin's dilemma, it states that in order to have world reserve currency, you must have the largest twin fiscal, which is spending, and trade, which is imbalance between countries that are importing and exporting. You need to have large and systemic and guaranteed, fiscal and trade deficits. So what that means is that if you are decreasing your fiscal and trade deficit, then you weaken your reserve currency status. The reason for that is because the Federal Reserve is a debt-based Ponzi scheme, and its main export of the host country, which is America, is to export dollars through debt slavery, either both domestically, which is wealth transfer, from those that can create money at 0% interest, like banks, even fractional, even just create dollars every time they issue a loan, away from those that have to borrow to meet living expenses, like credit cards at 30%, or even payday loans at extreme usurious rates like 40%. It is the absolute transfer of all of the real assets through debt slavery. And that's what's systemically happened in both Europe and America through the fractional reserve system. It has just been mass transfer of assets to those that are able to control and get closer to the lower interest rate and the money printer and the creation of the dollar, the pound, or the euro. Right. So because it is the being a world reserve currency means you have to export those dollars, then anything that stops the global export of those dollars means that you will no longer, or you will weaken your power in being world reserve currency. So let's have a look at what's actually happening right now. And again, I don't want to say don't make this into a Trump versus Biden versus Republican versus Democrat. That's the scam they need you to believe in order to consent to the system and be distracted from how the system actually works. That is the vision that I guess they use in order to get you into all of this debt slavery, believing that there is a democracy, and believing that if you take on this debt, then it is then you're contributing to the patriotism of the country because you're supporting the dollar, as it were, you're supporting the industry. Okay, so what are the actions that the Trump administration has taken? Again, not a Trump thing. This would have happened, whoever it is, they just install the person that is most appropriate. And if you want to weaken the dollar through tariffs, then find the person that has been, connected, and I'm not saying he's a pedophile, but he's been connected to Jeffrey Epstein through his real estate career. He's always been talking about tariffs, so there's a political ideology for the last 35 years. He went through many, many scandals in the court. He had lawfare and a couple of assassination attempts. So clearly, every attempt in order to compromise Trump has been used, and the reason that he is president is because it works. So clearly he works for his backers, and you can follow the money to understand how every policy he's implemented is in line with his backers, whether it be Elon Musk, the the Mellon family, or Adelson and Israel First agenda, Mellon a global banking agenda, and Elon a technocracy stateless agenda, to build robotics and artificial intelligence within America to compete with the manufacturing that happens within China. All of those policies have happened based upon the backers that pay the Trump administration. And his job is to put a MAGA narrative to make it acceptable to the American people, when it will do the exact opposite of the pitch that was given that made you think we're winning. It's MAGA. And I'm sorry to tell you this news, but let's have a look at the actual policy. So the MAGA narrative, number one, we're taking out the deep state. What was the end of that? It was taking out of USAID, which is one of the money laundering organizations that America uses in order to implement colored revolutions, fund organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, training camps, and bribe countries in order to be addicted to their dollars, and then engage in the operations that makes countries have to take on the IMF debt. So if you remove USAID, and the other one is the National Endowment of Democracy, you are removing the soft power globally that gets the world addicted to dollars. And now obviously you can use the MAGA narrative that we're taking on the deep state, when in reality you're weakening the dollar. You're taking away a vital terrorist organization that gets the world and forces the world onto the dollar standard, which then leads to you borrowing from the IMF, having dollar debt, printing your own currency, weakening your currency relative to the dollar, and then spending it on the corporate interest, i.e. the military industrial complex, or borrowing it through the bank on interest, or purchasing goods that the corporations engage in these covert operations to force you onto the dollar standard through all these covert wars. So that is a vital piece of the world reserve currency. What's the next one? Let's have a look at United Nations. So United Nations is an organization that allows America to change and regime change many regimes in Africa that don't allow America to rape, steal, and pillage their rare earth minerals, their commodities, their gold mining, and in the Middle East, like the oil mining and whatever it is. And so by taking away the voting, one of the primary voting powers at the United Nations, America gets to veto vote. For example, while America says that they're working on a Palestinian cause, America, year after year, veto votes away from Palestinian self-determination, because Israeli power is how they exert the military-industrial complex profits that steal dollars from the average American and hands it over to the large corporations that prop up this network. And so by taking away veto power, or the percentage of veto power in the United Nations, you're losing the ability to control the global south, because it is through that veto that these crimes against humanity are allowed to happen. And for example, you sanction the ICC or court whenever it goes against American interests, like Israel, when it gets caught in its genocide. And so by taking away the United Nations, you're again losing massive soft power. What about the whole, we're going to do peace with Russia and NATO, you need to pay? Well, NATO is a sales machine for the military-industrial complex. It uses the CIA in order to do covert operations, like it did in Ukraine. It did a coup in 2014. It then did operations to expand NATO and force Europeans to print more dollars at the European Central Bank level to spend it back into the military-industrial complex within America in order to prop up those profits. And therefore, it does agitation and it does covert operations to make sure that there is a constant flow of spending into the military side. And so by coming out of NATO, you're essentially weakening a vital construct of the euro dollar at the same time as weakening the petrodollar by wiping out USAID. So now you've taken 3 measures to weaken the dollar. The final one is tariffs. Now, in America, the issue of debt and having this massive twin fiscal and trade deficit, it means that you have to have that trade deficit and you have to have ever increasing levels of debt, which is why there's like $10 trillion in the short term that needs to be refinanced right now. Because if you pay down the debt, which is a complete lie, every time you pay down the debt, you decrease the number of dollars. And so you need to continually roll over that debt and siphon off more money from the average American person and then export that inflation globally in order to, prop up the profits of banks and the corporate interests that benefit from the debt-based Ponzi scheme called the dollar, which is what facilitates the massive wealth confiscation. And then that money can be used in order to bribe politicians, buy political power, and exert more influence in asset stripping all of the average American person for that corporate interest. So, by doing tax reform rather than monetary reform, which is what tariffs is. Tariffs is a tax reform that is then meant to lead to lower income tax, and income tax was created at the same year of the Federal Reserve, so that it's part of that construct of siphoning off wealth to pay the interest on a debt-based Ponzi scheme. But by using the trade war, it is a recognition and the final strategy, as it were, in order to weaken the dollar, retreat America to a regional power by losing all of its negotiations, losing its ability to push dollars on the world through this trade deficit, and therefore focusing on becoming a regional power only. Now, why is that being done? And obviously the MAGA narrative is the world's ripping us off. Europe needs to pay for their war. The deep state and the Biden and the Democrats have been corrupt, USAID. So all of that is acceptable MAGA narrative to his voter base in order to achieve the goals of systemically weakening the dollar and having those mass capital outflows that we saw on what they call Liberation Day. And Liberation Day was appropriately named because it was about liberating the world from the dollar. Now, let's do a bit of if-then. This is what's happening now. That's why gold is at all-time high. That's why the BlackRock ETF was launched to get all the banks and financial institutions into Bitcoin before this. That's why there was an escalation where Russia wasn't weakened and therefore that transition power over to the BRICS corridor. That's why sanctions were more aggressive in order to push the BRICS corridor into creating alternative mechanisms for China, Iran, and Russia to put together a system that works without the dollar, without SWIFT, a barter system that can circumvent sanctions through trade, so that the Belt and Road Initiative, which is where China invests in the global south, so that those economies can be built up and reverse the effect of the International Monetary Fund, which was destroying economies so that they can't compete, and then using covert wars to steal resources for the profits of the large corporations, versus the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China saying, we've got goods, we've got a manufacturing base. We're not going to tell you how to run your country, but we'd like to invest in infrastructure so that you can become more wealthy and buy more of our goods. And we can exert more power through those bilateral trade agreements. And so all of this is happening right now. Now, let's do a bit of an if-then. And so the reason that I think that's happening is because, as I said, no politician there's no democracy. Global finance owns America. Like China owns $27 trillion of assets across real estate, bonds, stocks, and various other investments, ports, whatever it may be. And so does the Middle East, because as the banks and the Federal Reserve System has been financializing and through debt slavery extracting all of the value out of the everyday Americans, handing it over to the multinational corporations, those multinational corporations have been investing it in a new world order. So vast sovereign wealth has accumulated through the petrodollar into the Qataris, the Emiratis, the Saudis, and then they have built significant economic power, which has changed the dynamics of the region. At the same time, Europe is, because it's siding with America and has the ECB, it's going down the same path but worse. And then China has been building their sovereign their surplus because it's got its manufacturing base, and then using that to accumulate approximately 22.5 tons of gold and $3 trillion of reserves to sustain and win the trade war. So the trade war is unwinnable, and anyone in economics knows that. Scott Bessent certainly knows that because he understands Triffin's dilemma, and he was also Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, the same guy that worked with George Soros. George Soros, the guy that was the hedge fund in order to exert the operation to short the British pound against the euro, and siphon off $3 billion in that geopolitical changing environment. So all of this is happening. Now, I'll give you a bit of 60-70 chess for all you MAGA people and all you Trump fans. It could be that this is happening, and then he's going to implement a monetary reform and therefore strengthen the dollar. So force the Fed into quantitative easing, lowering rates. Somehow there's some crazy strategy that lowers the 10-year and 30-year bonds, which are rising or steady right now. And if for some reason manages to execute that, then launches a stable coin, and the important part is the stable coin that takes down fractional reserve banking so that banks can slowly increase their reserves by issuing stable coins, and then you remove the special subsidy that banks get from creating the dollar. And so you could transition to stable coins, but here's the key things. If the stable coin keeps the yield for the issuer, then it is neo-banking. And it will have the same result. It's a debt-based Ponzi scheme. But if the yield can be received by anyone that owns the stable coin, then it can actually be used to systemically actually strengthen or change the debt-based Ponzi scheme or weaken the debt-based Ponzi scheme through mechanisms like converting it into Bitcoin, building strategic reserves on corporate treasuries, individual and also at the governmental level. So if you get stable coins, if all of that happens, and you also get a Bitcoin strategic reserve to accumulate an asset, maybe you nationalize a company like MicroStrategy, or you implement a 1933 executive order like happened under FDR, where he confiscated all the golds off American, issued them Federal Reserve notes and took their gold. You could do a similar thing with the Bitcoin ETF, and you could issue some stable coins in exchange, and then America suddenly would have, almost a chunk of Bitcoin. It could, in a short period of time, if it did a strategy like that, it could get like 1.5 million of Bitcoin, have it as their strategic reserves, issue a stable coin, hand it over to people like that back Trump. Like Trump's got a company with Steve Witkoff that's launching a stable coin. Elon's got a company that's working with Visa, combining it with Grok AI and building essentially a social credit score with all the social data that will be integrated into that stable coin. Trump's backers, like the Mellon banking family, they're getting into custody and then issuing probably stable coins. And so all of the technocrats, I'm sure Zuckerberg will be given one, I'm sure Amazon will be given one. They can carve out the dollar, but if they keep the yield for themselves, then they're just simply asset stripping America with a neo-technocracy version of the model. If they pass the yield on, then there's actually the opportunity for reform alongside Bitcoin strategic reserves, alongside a fading out of fractional reserves, replacing it with stable coins, alongside whatever they're going to do, to get rates under control to refinance the economy. So if he does that, then my analysis is wrong, and in fact they are looking to keep the dollar as the world reserve currency and not weaken it systemically. If he doesn't do that, then this is just asset stripping in the name of MAGA, because his backers have already decided that economic power is now in China through the BRICS, which is going to be investing in the global south and partnering with the GCC, which is the wealthy countries in the Middle East. And there will be normalization in Iran with a nuclear deal, and there will be a weakening of Israel. Israel will still exist, but it will be regime changed because it exerts its economic power from the power of America and the power of Europe, And if it no longer is needed to keep violence and wars in the regions, then the point of Israel is no longer needed to service the military-industrial complex, and the financial institutions will say there is more money to be made in investing in China, investing in BRICS, investing in America's technocracy, investing in the military-industrial complex in Europe, investing in stability in the Middle East, and ushering in a much, much, much more profitable model than World War III. So that is what I think is happening right now. I believe that people need to understand America's being transitioned into a technocracy with all of the parts of the ecosystem, whether it be energy that goes to rare earth minerals, that then goes to precious metals, that are then converted into semiconductor chip components to build data centers, that then have artificial intelligence, software, Bitcoin mining, and then stable coins and robotics that replace jobs, so that it can transition into those that have Bitcoin and those that are in the debt-based Ponzi scheme, which will likely be on a universal basic income based upon your social credit score. And so all of the wealthy people, they're going into gold and they're going into Bitcoin to avoid being the person that ends up on a universal basic income. Europe's starting a stable coin right now. America's got their stable coin. Europe is experimenting with CBDCs. Trump is also experimenting with removing the Constitution by essentially taking away First Amendment rights by saying that you can be deported for freedom of speech if you speak against Israel, which is a part of the war machine of the military-industrial complex as well. And so all of this is being weaponized. Everything's being beta tested. Remember, Palantir beta tested all of the artificial intelligence technology, which led to the genocide that's being experimented and all the deaths that are happening across the Middle East in order to transition to this new power structure where Israel is essentially... and Iran's going to be normalized, GCC's the power, and Israel's going to be normalized into something very different under the control of the new power structure. And the GCC and BRICS will align. Capital will outflow. Capital will stay within America of anyone involved in the robotics and AI and crypto ecosystem, which is the new vision for the technocracy. And the rest will flow into the new power structures and new investments in these new regions that have been liberated from the dollar. And so all you need to do is say if then. And so that is my if then. At the moment, this is systemic weakening of the dollar in recognition to break the world up into blocks, to have capital outflow and redistribution of wealth, wipe out small businesses in America through tariffs, while the large corporations will get all the exemptions and they can consolidate just like COVID, with the impact of COVID, which was under the Trump and Biden administration. So this is bipartisan. And I'm sorry, you will be given all the MAGA narratives, but you need to protect yourself. So that is what I think is happening. And in answer to your question, I believe that this is a recognition of new power structure around the world. And we are going to have a systemic weakening of the dollar. Last time this happened, the Dutch guilder took 10 to 20 years, the British pound 10 to 20 years. And I think things may happen faster, maybe the same. We shall see. There's uncertainties. It depends what happens between the monetary reform, the Fed. But you cannot change anything through tax reform because it is a monetary issue. So I hope that was all useful. And we will keep, navigating this together. And as new information changes, it's not a perfect science. It's a fluid situation. Things can change. But as things change, I will let you know and I'll keep updating. Please do like, please do share, please do retweet. You need to focus on solutions. You need to make sure you're positioning yourself. If you want, expect the best, but prepare for the worst. Because I think if you are... aligning your career with where the opportunity is, the global opportunities or the technocracy, and anything around that, then you'll be in the boom market. If you're in other areas, it may be time to skill change. We're going into AI. Things are going to change. Robotics are going to take jobs. And of course, the boycott of the system is take your money out of the Federal Reserve System with your savings. And what the central banks are doing is they're putting it in gold. And what other financial institutions, they're putting a percentage of that into Bitcoin. And what individuals are doing to protect themselves is they're saving in Bitcoin because it's an FU to the system. It's a boycott of the system so we can get on with this transition and liberate the world from the dollar. Because here's the cold, hard reality. There will be more peace under this new model. Multipolarity over the global hegemon is just, it created essentially across the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve model an estimated 300 million deaths through covert and overt wars. And it is time to end that. It is time to allow countries to compete, get into more free markets. And I certainly believe that either story is still a Bitcoin story. Because if you get the systemic weakening of the dollar, that is still a Bitcoin de-dollarizing and working with all the other opportunities in a multipolar world. If you get the Fed pumping and doing another debt-based Ponzi scheme, then some of that money will flow into Bitcoin. And if we are moving into blocks and regional powers and capital outflow, then I believe that the countries will all strategically start to compete, and America is likely to build its Bitcoin strategic reserves. We've already got China, Russia, and Iran saying that they've been trading in both barter and using crypto while they're building their alternative payment systems as well. And so you need to protect yourself and line yourself up accordingly. But in summary, the TLDR, as it currently stands, every policy that Trump is implementing is in line with who financially backs him, and it is a systemic weakening of the dollar in order to shrink America into a regional technocracy while splitting capital around the world into blocks and entering into a new era of peace rather than World War III, with all the craziness that can happen in such a massive change in the world. So follow me, like, share. I do believe that people need this information. I'll always tell you what I believe to be true. You can tell me I'm deluded, but I will keep telling you what I'm actually seeing by following the money, ignoring the media, and ignoring what politicians say they're doing, because they lie to you constantly, and they work not for you. They work for layer one, the Federal Reserve, the money printer, and layer two, the criminal intelligence deep state network that wants to steal your wealth and hand it over to corporate interest. Has no emotion, no money, no humanity, will kill, rape, pillage, and engage in crimes against humanity to prop up their large drug trafficking, sex trafficking, weapons trafficking, and human trafficking criminal networks. I shall see you in the next video. Peace.